I'm here at McIntosh Reserve today with my brother John. Now, he already mentioned the Treaty of Indian Springs. Now, one of our next stops we're gonna go, maybe not today, but Indian Springs State Park, which, fun fact, did you know that was actually the first state park in United States history? And that's where the Treaty of Indian Springs was signed. I'd say it's about 50, 60 miles from here. It's out near Forsyth, Georgia, in Monroe County, I believe. But anyway, we're here at McIntosh Reserve. Now, it's called McIntosh Reserve because land surveyors originally reserved this portion to possibly build a town for the Creek Indians. Now, because of the Chattahoochee River, it flooded a lot, and it wasn't really suitable to build a town. But you can see Chief McIntosh built his house here. That's a replica. So yeah.
One of the few original things to remain on site, while his house is a faithful reconstruction, is this stone that was commissioned by Chief McIntosh himself, and it was used to help travelers hitch their horses on his Acorn Bluff property. They called it Loch Chow Talafal. Nowadays it's just called McIntosh Reserve. Well, it stayed here after his death in 1825 up until 1916, when it was moved to the local university, and eventually they brought it back after seeing its significance to Native Americans. And it's interesting to think of all of the people who would have come here. Perhaps Manoa himself hitched his horse against this stone while they were killing his family.
Behind me now is the grave of Chief William McIntosh, who was famously killed on this very spot in 1825. Now, his story is often wrongly portrayed as a story of collaboration with the U.S. government here in the state of Georgia. In reality, he probably would have told you a story of his attempt to survive as a people. Understand that after the Revolutionary War, both the Creek and the Cherokee were formerly allied with the British government, and now that they're gone and you have a fledgling American state, it would be very easy to be wiped out as a tribe or to have absolutely nobody to trade with and go through the worst economic trouble you can imagine befalling a society. So he teamed up with Andrew Jackson and fought in the War of 1812. He fought at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and in 1823 his cousin George Troup was elected governor of Georgia. So in 1825 he signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, and what this did was it moved the Creek tribes further up into Alabama, expelling them from Georgia. However, in 1818, he had actually signed into law a provision which would create the lawmenders. And the lawmenders, their sole purpose was to go out and execute anybody who would challenge the sovereignty of the Creek Nation as a people. And this group was led by Manoa. And Manoa led about 120 to 150 people down to the cabin just 100 yards over that way, where they besieged it. They pulled out Chief William McIntosh, and someone stabbed him in the heart, and then they hung him up and just shot him over 50 times. His wife begged for them to bury him in his suit, but they buried him in a grave naked right here.
And this is actually where the lawmender killings took place. William's eldest son, Chili, was also sentenced to die, but managed to escape after possibly being shot. Another chief was in the cabin with William McIntosh, Itome Tustungi, and he was killed for signing the treaty. Later that day, lawmenders actually found the Hawkins brothers, probably related to Benjamin Hawkins, the Indian agent in charge of the signing, and both were signers of the treaty. So they hanged Samuel and shot his brother Benjamin, but he made a mad dash into the woods and managed to survive. Now, a lot of these people might actually be buried up at the cemetery at the entrance to the park, an old colonial cemetery from the early 1820s.
William McIntosh desperately tried to organize his tribe, but because there was internal division between the more nationalistic Red Stick and the White Stick, he chose collaboration with the Whites because he believed if he didn't, then they would be wiped out as a people.
Here's a few more things to think about when talking about William McIntosh, who signed the Indian Removal Treaty for the Creek at Indian Springs in 1825. He did so because his first cousin was elected governor of Georgia just 2 years prior and promised him protection and gave him a bribe payout. He also likely did it under duress, knowing that people would come down hard on his tribe if he didn't. But because of this bribe, and because they promised that he would be allowed to live here, overlooking the river with his own little tavern and way station, he took that bribe. And it's also important to note that he was the son of a Tory who fought in the American Revolution for the British. And basically he saw that the Americans were here to stay. They defeated the British with their military might. He met with Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson remarked that he was well versed in both Indian and American politics, and that he was very well read and well spoken. So William McIntosh was, you could call him a glass half empty kind of guy, and he saw the ability to make a little bit of gain for himself and he took it, but that doesn't necessarily make him a bad person, because he also considered this would probably be the only way for his tribe to survive as a people in neighboring Alabama.
Now, William McIntosh, again, was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and his wife was later quoted as saying something to the effect of, "My husband died at the hands of the government. He was trying to appease the government and he was killed by the Indians. And it's between these two fires that my husband dies."
And this is actually a fantastic vantage point to see on the property of Chief William McIntosh where his fort across the river would have gone. Of course, there was no other way to really cross the river here and make your way west into Alabama without crossing this area right here. And you'd have to, of course, pay Chief McIntosh in order to do it. And along the way, William McIntosh actually had a good deal of news, because if you wanted to pass through here, likely you actually had some news of current events, which couldn't be gleaned from the newspapers of the day, which were very expensive and hard to come by. And here's an interesting find. Keep in mind, I'm going to leave both of these here, but right where the killing took place, you have a piece of worked flint, and a piece of flint that looks like it was probably worked hundreds of years ago because the outer layer's oxidized. Understand that this was a vital trade route between the Creek and Cherokee going into Alabama, so naturally these are very likely artifacts from back in the 1800s. I also want to point out some of these beautiful lilies called Atamasco flowers. They usually bloom around Easter, and the name comes from an Indian word meaning under grass, and it's just about Easter right now. And this is on the ford overlooking the river. This area is also known as Council Bluff, and it was here that in 1821 the headmen and chiefs of several different tribes met, because again, you must remember the Creek were not one unified tribe. They were composed of many different peoples, and they met here to discuss the boundaries between them and the Cherokee. And that was agreed upon in 1821, just a few years before Chief McIntosh was killed about a quarter mile beyond this hill.
Replica of Chief McIntosh's home. As you can see, Acorn Bluff Inn and Tavern is built circa 1839. It's a two-story dog trot design, moved from Center, Alabama in 1987, similar to the original William McIntosh house and inn, which was burned in 1855. Now, you'll notice there's a large, I guess I'd call it a breezeway. Is that what you...
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a large breezeway, helps regulate temperature, because back in the day you didn't have air conditioning. You got rooms up top, you got rooms down here. Now one thing, a lot of the time at these old inns, they would let travelers stay for free because travelers had one vital resource that was hard to come by back then. News. They could tell you what was going on long before you heard about it in the newspapers.
And back in the day, Carroll County also had a border with the Cherokee. So you would have news from the Cherokee, you would be able to presumably cross, this was Acorn Bluff, and you could cross the Chattahoochee River right over there, and the travelers would hitch their horses on this rock here. Is an old horse hitch, but it's been on loan to this county park since 2017. I hope they keep it here. But I'm noticing, Jordan, on your jacket, the Okmulgee Mounds. Right there, yeah.
That's Fort Mountain.
Right at the bottom,
Oh,
right there,
here.
yeah.
Yeah. So I've been to Ocmulgee Mounds. That one is a part of the National Park Service. I've also been to Etowah Mounds, which is a state historic
Well,
site.
did you hear what I was saying about the Ocmulgee Mounds?
I did. Didn't the federal government give it back to the...
They did. They
And
gave it to
then-
Manawa.
And it sat dormant for years until
They
Great
built a
Depression.
railroad right
They built a
through it.
railroad right through it. And one thing that stood out to me is when you're standing on top of the biggest mound, you can see skyscrapers from Macon off
You
in
can.
the
It's
distance.
beautiful.
And it's kind of surreal because you're standing on mounds that are thousands of years old, and then off in the distance you got big skyscrapers. I wouldn't even say it's a bad thing. It's just such a contrast. I think it's kind of interesting.
And on the outskirts of McIntosh Reserve, you've got some of the evidence of the first white settlers in the area. So Carroll County, because Chief McIntosh of the Creek was kind of collaborating with American authorities, they awarded him with his own sort of refuge. And these were some of the first families to move in alongside him. They were white settlers, the Bowens, and there's quite a few McCoys in here, who moved in right alongside him. And they kind of lived in the outskirts of what's now Whitesburg. And these are some very, very old-style graves, but most of them in this cemetery aren't really accounted for anymore. You can see old headstones here, which are just stones. And the ones behind me, the larger ones, those are usually from the 1840s. These folks would have probably arrived here shortly after Indian removal in the 1820s, when the Treaty of Indian Springs was signed, and some of the families lived here until as recently as, what date is here? 1923? This area around Indian Springs State Park was used for centuries by the Muskogee people and the creek to heal their sick. You can see a little creek bed right to the south of this picture. And for hundreds of years, they would camp along these hills in tents. And right now, they have built a little bit of a better area up here to have the spring water flow out of. It's an old spring house. And in 1821, they signed the first Treaty of Indian Springs, which relinquished a lot of their land. In 1825, the second Treaty of Indian Springs relocated them to Alabama. And in 1826, the Treaty of Washington turned this land, this sacred land of the Muskogee people, over to the American government, and it became the first state park. But you can imagine, hundreds of people camped around here from wounds they received in battles, perhaps the Battle of Taliwa in 1755, which lost the Creek land in North Georgia, recuperating from their wounds here on the hillside. And this is kind of the layout of Indian Springs. The main well is actually right there. They built it with the Civilian Conservation Corps to kind of update it, but you can still see the centuries-old stone basin that the water comes from. But of course, nowadays you have dumb kids trying to destroy it, so they put a big plexiglass dome over it. And walking right out over here, just across from the stream, you've got the Indian Springs Hotel and Museum, where the treaty was actually signed. And you can see it running right along here. And the actual treaty signing, 1821 and 1825, both took place up here. And this rock at the lower left has an interesting story.
This more or less split the creek into red stick and white stick. The red stick favoring independence and sovereignty, and the white stick favoring assimilation. Of course, Chief McIntosh, who signed the treaty signing over the land, was a white stick creek. And because of this, during the signing of the treaty, you actually had a more conservative, pro-sovereignty chief standing atop this rock and speaking to the evils of this treaty, which would sign away their very last land in Georgia, as well as their most sacred of springs, Indian Springs, which for hundreds of years they had at the center of their territory. Just as it would be impossible to talk about the Indian Wars in the Southeast without mentioning men like Colonel Elijah Clark and Chief William McIntosh, there's no way to talk about these conflicts without bringing up Colonel Benjamin Hawkins. Now, in many ways, Hawkins's career reflects early American political climates at the time. He and his father were both veterans of the Revolutionary War, and his father was a hero. And he became a friend of George Washington, and after the war, he was a senator, he was in charge of Indian affairs, he was a plantation owner, he promoted slavery, and he tried to civilize the Creek by introducing the American form of slavery to their tribe. In fact, in 1796, George Washington requested that he take charge of Indian affairs. And this was especially important here in Georgia because the Creek shared a border with the white settlements to the east, and the Creek and Cherokee were both formerly aligned with the British, and now they've lost their main supplier, and they're hungry, and they're raiding your settlements. So quickly he learned Creek, and he took a wife, Susan Downs, who many believe was a Creek woman, and because the Creek society was matrilineal, they actually took kindly to him. And then he learned Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, and they called him the beloved man of 4 nations. And in many respects, he cultivated a good relationship with the Creek close to white settlements. They called these the Lower Creek, or the White Stick Creek. Now contrast this to the creek that lived some distance over the Flint River here behind me in Alabama, which were called the Red Stick Creek. Now in 1812, when the British initiated the War of 1812, this caused a very vital conflict within the Creek tribe, and the Red Stick broke off from the White Stick and initiated wars over in Alabama, which would become the Creek War that actually got the U.S. involved. And because of this, after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, the Creek eventually would be relocated. Now, the agent in charge at the time, of course, was Benjamin Hawkins, who lived right here on his plantation with his slave prison and with Creek envoys coming every other day to talk about the events of the war. And he died in 1816 to be buried, much like Chief William McIntosh, on a hill overlooking his property. And for a long time he was considered a beloved man of 4 nations, but in hindsight, I'm sure many of those Creek and Cherokee viewed him as a man who came along and paved the road without them knowing it for their relocation to Indian Territory.